A reading from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." May God speak to us through these verses today. Ever since I was a boy, I have been a big fan of science fiction, books and movies. A lot of those stories deal with a small group of people who maybe survive some kind of global catastrophe. Maybe it's a nuclear war that turns the planet into a desert wasteland. Maybe it's an environmental disaster that creates a new ice age. When I was a teen, I really liked these stories because, well, come on, they're just really cool. And sometimes they had spaceships and aliens and lots of action. But as I got older, I realized that even though science fiction might set these stories in the far future, they were really about things that were going on in the present. Whatever disaster causes these events is the result of what we are doing now. They're usually the outcome of choices made by people. And I would read interviews with these science fiction writers and filmmakers, and they would admit that they simply looked at what people are doing, and then they took those things to a logical conclusion. Now, in a way, that is very similar to what a prophet does. Like the prophets of old, they would sound an alarm, warning us, here's what will happen if you keep doing this. That's what the prophets did, and the Bible is filled with prophecies about these huge cataclysmic events that shake up the world, about things getting so bad that it seems like the world is on the verge of coming to an end, and only God can do anything about it. We call this kind of prophecy apocalyptic. The biggest examples of apocalyptic prophecy in the Bible are the books of Daniel and Revelation, which our Bible study is taking on right now, in fact. The word apocalypse comes from a Greek word that means an unveiling or a revelation. But apocalyptic is also sprinkled through the Gospels, like our reading today from Luke's Gospel, when Jesus prophesies to the disciples. They're looking at the temple in Jerusalem, and they comment on the beauty, the magnificence of this great structure. But Jesus then says, it will all be torn down. They won't even leave one stone on top of another. And then he goes on to speak using apocalyptic language and imagery from the ancient prophets. Now, the idea of the temple's destruction was unthinkable. It was huge. It was expensive. It had its own military force. It was the center of worship and it was the heart of the nation. Even if someone was foolish enough to try to destroy it, surely God would not let that happen. Even talking this way about its destruction was dangerous and could get you in trouble. And in fact, it is what led to Jesus' arrest and trial. Now, these disciples, no doubt stunned to hear the temple will fall, ask when this will happen. What signs should they look for? Well, first, Jesus warns them not to follow people who will appear and claim to be leaders in his name. Jesus knows that there are many in Israel who want to use force and violence to change things, even some of his own followers. He suspects they may try to rally an army in his name. Don't listen to them, says Jesus. Then he mentions wars and insurrections, nation against nation, natural disasters, plagues, famines, and so on. And he says that his followers will be persecuted and they will be dragged before the authorities. They will sometimes be betrayed even by their own friends and families. That's some pretty awful stuff. But frankly, we can see a lot of that reported today in our headlines and newscasts. You know, in one form or another, these sorts of things have happened since the beginning of human history, and they will continue to happen. In many ways, each generation experiences its own apocalypse. And in many ways, each generation gets the apocalypse that it brings on itself. When Luke's gospel was written, everything that Jesus prophesied in these verses had already happened and were still happening. Christians were persecuted and arrested. About 40 years after Jesus died, the temple was torn down. Israel was destroyed because insurgent leaders did raise little armies, and that brought the big Roman army down on them. And as a result, people died of violence and hunger and illness. But as Jesus reveals to us throughout the Gospels, many of these things happened because the government and religious leaders were busy pretty much pleasing themselves rather than pleasing God. It all could have been avoided. And like the prophets before him, Jesus tried to show them how to avoid it. At the same time, Jesus is also a realist. And so he just prepares his followers, get ready, it's coming. Now notice, though, what he does not tell them. He does not tell them, run, hide, keep quiet. You will go through these things, he says. But he says that we need to see them as opportunities to testify. These terrible events will be chances for them to proclaim God's truth. It'll be dangerous and may even cost them their lives. But Jesus promises that they won't go through this alone. He will be with them. He says that he will even give them the words and the wisdom to speak. And we are told not a hair of their heads will perish. Now, Jesus must mean not perish in some ultimate or spiritual sense, because as we well know, many of his followers did perish. But we also know that Jesus promises there really is no death for God's people. So he encourages them to persist, to endure. And by endurance, they will gain their souls. And of course, one of the great promises in all of Scripture is that none of those evils will win in the end. On the other side of every apocalypse, God is still there. Now, these are the same promises that we have as we experience our own apocalyptic fears. I don't know about you, but I frequently get asked, do I think these are the end times? We see these signs. Well, earlier I said that each generation seems to get its own apocalypse, and perhaps one that it deserves. Can we deny that the issues we are witnessing today, famine, plague, corruption, that they are nobody's fault but our own, and the result of what generations before us have done or failed to do. What we see today is simply the logical extension of what happens when human beings let greed and power and selfishness and violence get the better of us, as they often do. And so perhaps we may think that in a very real sense there really has been, is, and will only be one apocalypse, one long pattern of destructive human behavior that keeps building on itself and getting worse because we keep finding new and better ways to be destructive. Now that might sound rather bleak, and we may feel helpless before such powerful forces, but we are not helpless. Whenever we speak out, whenever we stand up for the causes of peace and justice and the well-being of people and of this world itself, then the Spirit of Jesus speaks through us and stands with us. So the question becomes, do we let these problems overwhelm us into silence, or do we see them as opportunities to testify? We have the same duties and responsibilities as God's people have always had. We have been given the words and the wisdom that we need. Will we use them? Scripture promises that God will triumph in the end. For I am creating a new heaven and a new earth, God says through the prophet Isaiah, where the lion and the lamb will eat together, and no one will hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, and the former things will not be remembered. That's the promise. That's the ultimate vision of our scriptures. It is what we strive for. It is what God is striving for in this world. The end of those things that destroy, the end of those things that hurt, the end of those things that keep us captive. The world has always gone through bad times, and I think sometimes we like to think that our time is worse than any other. Previous generations have said those things. Future generations will probably say them too. Each generation faces its own apocalypse, and each generation faces the choice of how we will deal with it. May this promise of the final triumph of God give us the strength, the courage, and the hope to endure, and by enduring, may we too gain our souls. Amen.